Welcome back, everyone. And we are in the third video about OWASP Top 10 LLM 2025. And today we will look at supply chain vulnerabilities surrounding LLMs. So supply chain is a very complex concept, right? And it's a primary source of attacks these days, not only when it comes to LLMs, but also with applications in general. And it's simply because you are using a lot of third-party components, third-party applications. Specifically, when you talk about LLMs, you use pre-trained models, right? Like which you can download, for example, from Hugging Face. You can download data sets which are large in size, right? And you don't really have the manual capability to analyze those, right? Like you would need another LLM to analyze large data sets on whether there is biased information in there and stuff like that. And then additionally, you have a lot of plugins, a lot of open source tools, which you can find on GitHub, for example. And they might have been written by people with good intent, or they might have been written by people with bad intent, right? And everyone can publish their stuff on GitHub. And it's surprising how many companies actually pull from GitHub and go like, oh yeah, this is useful, I integrate this in my code, without fully understanding what this actually does, right? And this is a huge problem, not just in the LLM field. Supply chain vulnerabilities are huge, but for the sake of this specific discussion, we are talking more about the LLM threats, right? So one of those things is like, for example, vulnerable models are used, right? Vulnerable models which may be backdoored, right? Like, so you read about something really cool, there's a cool model, you download it, and then it has a backdoor in there and exfiltrates all your data out, right? Like, so you need to pay attention to from where you download those models and how you vet them, basically. Third-party package vulnerabilities, nice plugins, especially when we talk about agentic AI these days and agents going out, browsing the web, doing autonomous tasks, kind of, right? Go out, place an order, whatever. And there may be neat snippets of code out there, neat packages, plugins, which people will deploy or integrate, and without even thinking about the risks, like what kind of, like who's maintaining this GitHub repo, for example. Like, can I just contribute to it and can I put some stuff in there, for example? And then the classical ones, like out of date packages, right? Like even if there's no malicious intent, but if they're out of date and there was a CVE found, for example, they need to be kept up to date. This is the same like for any library you use in application development or any repository. Is this kept up to date, or is it 10 years old or 3 years old or whatever, and hasn't been maintained and no one is looking after that? And this is very problematic in general. Like companies take the path of least resistance and like integrate directly from GitHub, and then after a while you find out, hey, this is a 17-year-old student or like kid who basically just likes coding, and then he or she decides to take it offline, right? And then you have a supply chain issue because your application broke at that point, right? And then obviously there is much more sinister cases where there may be someone who does this on purpose and produces good tools, and then all of a sudden they start including code which is malicious, right? And goes on like plugin exploits, like specific plugins, LLM plugins, which do useful things, but if they are exploited, you may exploit the whole chain, right? And poison PyPI packages and stuff like that, you have. GitHub is trying a lot of these things like to mitigate this, but it's not fully possible. And there's other sources out there than just GitHub, right? And the problem is developers are under extreme stress to push code and to get going because they have a lot of stress from their management. And then security is often overlooked, and that leads to supply chain vulnerabilities. So just one example here, right? Like there was a vulnerability last year. This has been disclosed and received a CVE. And this was in the very well-known LangChain framework. And basically what it allowed was SQL injection through that specific length chain. And you know what can happen with SQL injection. I mean, denial of service can be happening if you can delete the database or certain data out of the database, manipulation of the data so the integrity is lost. You can read out so the information disclosure principle is violated and those kind of things. And because everyone is rushing to get AI technology to the market and integrate it into their workflows, these problems obviously need to be looked at significantly, right? Like you need to take those seriously. It's the same as in the AppSec world, that you keep everything up to date and you really analyze the supply chain. So what you should do, well, vendor security assessments, if possible, right? Like if it's open source code, it's usually straightforward because you can go through the code. And what I also recommend is host it yourself, right? Like don't rely on GitHub, especially if there's a lot of contributors and stuff and anyone can contribute or something. Like get it down and host it yourself so you have control over the code. That's a general thing. Again, in AppSec that applies as well. Secure model and data provenance. So do a thorough analysis of the whole supply chain. Like who has the fingers in there? Like what kind of dependencies you have? What kind of libraries you need to pull in and things like this? Where's the model coming from? Is it a reputational model provider, right? Or is it like just someone who says, well, I am a reputational model provider, so get Martin LLM, you know? And there's also like the concern, obviously, about geographical models, like certain models coming out of China, certain models coming out of other jurisdictions where privacy and certain other aspects are not as important as in the West, for example. So those kind of things need to be taken into account. Dependency management, okay, I already mentioned that. Like make sure that you are really aware of what kind of dependencies you have, because that's not just a security angle, that's also an availability angle. And like if my example from earlier, the 17-year-old decides to become a surfer now and shuts his GitHub repo down, then what are you going to do, right? Always zero trust and access controls for everything. Like make sure that you limit the access down to the business need, right? Like when you use, when you have an LLM system, like what it's supposed to do, don't give it excessive privileges and stuff. And by default, it's zero trust. And the zero trust should not only be towards the user, but also to the supply chain, right? Like this is very important. And then resilience and redundancy planning. So fallbacks, like what do you do if X fails, right? Like if this is no longer maintained and you have source code, the GitHub repo goes offline, are there any alternatives? Are there commercial alternatives? Do you have the right paperwork in place with them? Who governs the risk, right? Like what is your risk responsibility versus what is theirs if it's a commercial setup? If it's open source, it's completely different, right? But if it's commercial, you need to hold them accountable as per contract and things like that. So that's supply chain vulnerabilities. LLM number 3 has risen up, is now number 3. I believe it was number 6 or 7 last year, and or in the previous LLM top 10. And now it's number 3. It's just behind information disclosure and prompt injection. I hope this makes sense, and I will see you in the next one.